I'm a 29-year-old guy, the middle child sandwiched between two sisters, Emily, 34, and Sophie, 25. If you'd asked me a few weeks ago, I'd have told you we're a pretty close-knit family. We're not perfect, but we've always been there for each other. At least that's what I thought. Lately, though, things have felt off. It started with small stuff, like not being in on jokes during family dinners. Emily and Sophie would be laughing about something, and when I'd ask, they'd just say, "Oh, it's nothing," or change the topic. I shrugged it off at first. I've been busy with work, and I figured I was just missing out on group chats or quick catch-ups. But then, it started happening more often. I'd find out about family plans at the last minute, where Emily would reference something I had no clue about. It was like there was this invisible thread connecting everyone except me. The first real sign that something was up happened at a family barbecue. We were all hanging out in the backyard, and Sophie was showing Emily something on her phone. They were giggling like kids, and I asked what was so funny. As soon as I spoke up, the laughter died. They exchanged this weird look before Sophie stuffed her phone in her pocket and said, "Oh, it's nothing important, it was awkward." I tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something. The weirdness hit a new level last weekend. I was at my parents' house helping my mom with her laptop. She's terrible with tech, so I'm the unofficial guy of the family. While I was sorting out her email, her phone buzzed on the table. I didn't mean to look, but the screen lit up, and I caught a glimpse of a notification. The family chat, the message preview was from Emily. "Just don't mention it in front of him today." My stomach dropped. The family chat? What the hell? I thought I was in the only family chat we had. You know, the one with the usual boring stuff, grocery lists, reminders, the occasional meme. But this wasn't that chat. This was something else, something I wasn't a part of. I didn't say anything to my mom. I just handed her back the laptop and made up an excuse to leave. On the drive home, I kept replaying that message in my head. Just don't mention it in front of him today. What were they hiding from me? Was it something about me? Did I do something to upset them? I decided not to confront anyone right away. Instead, I started paying closer attention. I remembered a few months ago when plans for a family trip got changed last minute. At the time, they said it was because of Emily's work schedule, but now I wasn't so sure. And then there were the inside jokes I didn't get, the side conversations that ended as soon as I walked into the room. I pulled up my own phone and scrolled through our family chat. It was exactly what I remembered, dry, basic stuff. Nothing like the message I saw on my mom's phone. There were no discussions, no jokes, no plans being made. Just logistical messages like, "Who's bringing dessert on Sunday?" It felt like a placeholder chat, something to keep me from noticing there was another, more active one. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer, so I called my best friend, Jason. We've been friends since college, and he's usually good at talking me down when I start spiraling. I told him everything, the weird looks, the secret chat, the message I saw. Jason joked that maybe they were planning a surprise party for me or something, but even he didn't sound convinced. He told me to just ask them about it directly, but I wasn't ready for that yet. If it wasn't something innocent, I didn't want to look paranoid or crazy. So I decided to test the waters a bit. The next time I saw Sophie, I casually asked if there were any new group chats I'd missed out on. She got this deer-in-the-headlights look before quickly saying no, just the usual one. Her answer was too quick, too rehearsed. It confirmed what I already suspected: she was lying. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the possible reasons for the secret chat. Had I done something to upset them? Were they talking about me behind my back? I grabbed my phone and did what any sane person does at 3 a.m. I went on Reddit. I searched for family secret chat and was surprised to find a bunch of posts from people who'd been in similar situations. Some found out their family was planning a surprise, but others discovered much worse. My anxiety skyrocketed reading those threads. The idea that my family might be hiding something serious from me kept me up all night. The next day, I tried asking Emily a similar question, just to see if I could get a different answer. She played it cool, saying there's only one family chat, but I noticed she wouldn't look me in the eye. It felt like she was deflecting, trying to steer the conversation back to work or something else. I left the conversation more convinced than ever that something was going on. I knew I couldn't keep tiptoeing around this forever. I was either going to drive myself crazy with overthinking, or I was going to have to confront them. But I wasn't ready yet. I needed more information. I decided then that I was going to get to the bottom of it, even if it meant having an uncomfortable conversation with everyone. I've always trusted my family, but now I'm starting to wonder if I've been naive. Either way, I'm going to find out what's really going on, and I'm not stopping until I get answers. Update 1. The next Sunday, we had a family dinner at Emily's place. It was one of those regular get-togethers we've been doing for years. Everyone brings a dish, we sit around the table, and catch up. I figured it was the perfect time to test the waters. I wanted to see if I could get any of them to slip up without making it too obvious that I was digging. We were in the middle of dinner, talking about random stuff like Sophie's new job and the latest movie Emily watched. I casually mentioned how I had to mute a few group chats on my phone because they kept blowing up during work. I made a joke about it, pretending it was no big deal. I noticed it immediately, the slight pause. Sophie glanced quickly at Emily, who didn't look up from her plate. I felt a rush of adrenaline. I wasn't imagining things. There was something they weren't telling me. After a moment, I went for it. "Hey, are there any group chats I'm not in?" I asked, keeping my voice light. It was almost like I was joking, but not really. The room went silent for a beat too long. Sophie gave this nervous laugh and started talking about dessert, like I hadn't just asked a direct question. My mom got up to clear the dishes, moving quickly, while my dad seemed completely oblivious, focusing on the last of his mashed potatoes. Emily, though, she didn't look up, just asked me about work instead, like she was trying to steer the conversation away. It was too obvious. I couldn't believe they were being this blatant about it. I leaned back in my chair and said, I know there's another family chat. I saw a notification on Mom's phone last week. That got their attention. Emily finally looked up, her face tightening. She didn't even try to hide her annoyance. My mom turned around from the sink, looking guilty as hell, while Sophie's smile dropped. My dad still had no idea what was going on. He just looked between us, confused. Emily was the first to speak up. She sounded defensive, telling me it wasn't any of my business what chats they had. She accused me of snooping on Mom's phone, which wasn't what happened at all. I didn't even get a chance to explain before my mom stepped in, trying to calm things down. She kept saying it's not what you think, but wouldn't explain any further. At this point, I wasn't going to drop it. I pressed harder, saying, if it's not a big deal, then why wasn't I included? What's so secret that I can't know? Sophie suddenly blurted out, it's not about you, okay? We were trying to protect you. Her voice cracked a little, and it caught me off guard. Protect me from what? That didn't make any sense. I asked her what she meant, but she clammed up, looking at Emily like she'd said too much. There was this heavy silence. They all exchanged looks, and I could see them trying to decide what to do next. My mom sighed, the kind of sigh that sounds like it's carrying a lot of weight. She sat back down at the table and said softly, we should have told you sooner. I asked her what she meant, and that's when she started explaining. Apparently, the group chat was created over a year ago. It wasn't just for jokes and family plans, it was to talk about Dad. They'd started noticing small things, little signs that something wasn't right with him. He'd forget simple things, repeat the same stories, or get confused about dates. At first, they thought it was just normal aging, but the symptoms kept getting worse. Emily took over, explaining that they didn't want to worry me until they were sure. They'd been using the chat to coordinate doctor appointments, share updates, and figure out what to do next. They were worried it might be early onset dementia, but they didn't have a diagnosis yet. They didn't want to tell me until they had more information. I just sat there, stunned. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All this time, I'd been feeling left out, thinking they were talking about me behind my back, when really they were dealing with something far bigger. I didn't know what to say. I felt this strange mix of shock, guilt, and hurt all at once. My mom apologized, saying they never meant to keep me in the dark. She admitted they should have told me sooner, but they thought they were sparing me the worry. Sophie was tearing up now, saying how hard it had been to keep this secret, especially since she almost slipped up so many times. Emily was quieter than usual, just nodding along. I got up and stepped outside for a minute. I needed air. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Jason, my best friend. I answered, and he could tell something was up right away. I told him what happened, how I'd found out about the chat, and what it was really about. He listened quietly, then told me to take a breath and give myself a minute before going back in. I leaned against the porch railing, staring out at the street. It was a weird mix of relief and sadness. I was glad it wasn't something malicious, but knowing what it was instead didn't feel any better. It was like I'd been hit with a wave I didn't see coming. Eventually, I went back inside. They were all sitting there, looking at me expectantly. I told them I needed some time to process everything. I wasn't mad, but I was overwhelmed. They nodded, understanding. My mom looked like she wanted to say more, but she held back. I left shortly after, promising we'd talk about it more later. As I drove home, I couldn't help but think about all the moments with Dad that suddenly made sense. The repeated questions, the little slips I'd brushed off. I wasn't sure how I felt yet, but I knew one thing. Things were about to change, whether I was ready for it or not. Update 2. After leaving Emily's house, I didn't reach out to anyone for a couple of days. I needed space to process what I'd just learned. My phone was full of missed calls and texts from both my sisters, but I couldn't bring myself to respond right away. Eventually, I saw a text from Emily asking if I was okay. I just replied with, I need some time. It wasn't much, but it was all I could manage at that point. Over the next few days, everything started clicking into place. I replayed moments from the past year with my dad. There were so many small things I'd brushed off without a second thought. I remembered a time when he called me twice in one day, telling the same story about a neighbor's dog. At the time, I thought he was just being forgetful. Then there was the weekend he came over and couldn't remember where I kept the coffee mugs, something he'd known for years. I'd joked about him losing his mind, but now it didn't seem funny. I found myself doing what anyone does when they're confused and overwhelmed. I Googled. I spent hours reading about early onset dementia, scrolling through medical articles, personal blogs, and Reddit threads from people sharing their own experiences. It was heartbreaking. I learned about the symptoms, the progression, and the emotional toll it takes on families. The more I read, the more it started to sink in. My dad wasn't just having a few senior moments. This was something far more serious. Finally, I decided to call my mom. I could hear the exhaustion in her voice when she picked up. I didn't waste time with small talk. I asked her to tell me everything, no more secrets, no more trying to protect me. She explained how it all started with little things like Dad getting lost driving to familiar places or forgetting dates. At first, they laughed it off, but then it got worse. He'd forget conversations he'd had just minutes before. He started struggling to remember basic information like his own birthday. That's when they realized it was more than just normal aging. Mom confessed that she and my sisters were scared. They didn't want to worry me until they were sure of what was happening. They'd been to multiple doctors, but there still wasn't a confirmed diagnosis. The uncertainty was killing them, and they thought keeping it quiet would make it easier. It didn't. I could tell from her voice that she was holding back tears. I thanked her for finally telling me the truth, then hung up, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. A little while later, Sophie called. She sounded nervous, almost like she was afraid I wouldn't answer. She told me how hard it was to keep this secret, especially since she's always been the emotional one in the family. She admitted she almost told me a dozen times, but Emily convinced her to hold off. Sophie said they thought I wouldn't handle it well, that I'd distance myself or fall apart. Hearing that stung a bit, but I let it slide. It was clear she was already beating herself up about it. We decided to meet at Emily's house that evening to talk things through as a family. It was a tense, quiet gathering at first. Emily looked tired, like she hadn't slept much. My mom kept fiddling with her wedding ring, while Sophie was staring at the floor. I broke the silence, telling them I didn't want any more secrets. If we were going to deal with this, we had to do it together. They nodded, agreeing. Emily admitted she was wrong to leave me out of it, saying she thought she was protecting me but realized now that she was only making things worse. Sophie apologized too, her voice shaky. She said she was scared and didn't know how to handle it. I told them I understood why they did it, but it still hurt. It felt like a small step towards mending things, even though there was still a lot left unsaid. We shifted the conversation to what comes next. We decided that we needed to take Dad to a specialist, someone who could give us a clearer diagnosis. We talked about long-term care options, which was a hard pill to swallow. The thought of needing to plan for that so soon felt like admitting defeat, but we couldn't avoid it any longer. Before I left, we agreed on a plan of action. I offered to take on some of the responsibilities, starting with scheduling the specialist appointment. Emily seemed relieved, probably because she'd been doing most of the heavy lifting. Sophie hugged me as I was leaving, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same team again. That night, I decided to update my Reddit post. I told everyone about the twist, how the secret chat wasn't about me but about my dad's health. I shared the whole story, including the part where I jumped to the worst conclusions. The responses were a mix of sympathy and validation. A lot of people said I was justified in feeling hurt, while others shared similar experiences with family secrets and dementia. It felt good to get it all out and read comments from people who understood what I was going through. I took a few more days to myself after that. I went on long walks, listened to podcasts, anything to clear my head. I wasn't ready to dive back into the thick of it just yet. I needed to decompress and figure out how I was going to handle this new reality. When I was ready, I sent a group text to Emily and Sophie. I told them I was in, whatever that meant for us going forward. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but at least now I wasn't in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, we'd come out of this stronger on the other side. Update 3. After taking a few days to myself, I finally felt ready to face everything head on. The silence had helped me process, but I knew I couldn't avoid my family forever. That's when I got a text from my dad. It was simple, just, "I love you, kiddo." For some reason, it hit me differently this time. Maybe it was because I knew what he was going through now. It was bittersweet, like he was reaching out through a fog I couldn't see. I replied back, telling him I loved him too. Later that day, Emily reached out with an unexpected message. She asked if I wanted to join the family chat now that I knew about it. She said it made sense for me to be a part of it. I hesitated for a minute, imagining how awkward it might feel stepping into this space that had been kept from me for so long. But I knew it was a necessary step if we were going to move forward as a family, so I told her to add me. When I opened the chat for the first time, it felt like entering a secret room full of whispers I wasn't supposed to hear. I scrolled up through old messages, and it was all there. Discussions about doctor appointments, medication updates, and moments of panic when Dad got confused or upset. I even saw a few messages from Sophie breaking down, saying she didn't know how much longer she could keep it together. Reading through it all was overwhelming. I'd been so focused on my own hurt that I hadn't considered how much they'd been dealing with alone. I messaged the chat, thanking them for adding me and saying I wanted to help from now on. Emily replied quickly, sounding relieved, and Sophie sent a heart emoji. It felt like a small step towards rebuilding the trust that had been broken. I decided to step up right away. I offered to take Dad to his next doctor's appointment, giving Emily and Sophie a break. They agreed, and the relief in their responses was obvious. The next day, I picked Dad up, and he seemed to be in good spirits. We drove to the park before the appointment, something we used to do a lot when I was a kid. He pointed out the ducks on the pond, telling me a story about how he once brought stale bread here as a boy. He laughed, then a few minutes later, started telling me the same story again. I nodded along, realizing this was part of the dementia. It was both heartbreaking and oddly comforting. It made everything real in a way it hadn't been before. It wasn't just stories from Emily or Sophie anymore. I was seeing it with my own eyes. At the doctor's office, Dad got confused about why we were there. He asked me 3 times in the waiting room if we were getting his car fixed. I just smiled and told him we were there for a checkup, trying to keep the mood light. It was a long appointment, full of tests and questions. The doctor spoke with me privately afterward, explaining that while there were still no concrete answers, the symptoms were consistent with early onset dementia. They recommended a new specialist, and I made a mental note to discuss it with my sisters later. That evening, we all gathered at Emily's place again. This time it felt different, less tense, more like we were finally on the same page. I told them about the appointment, what the doctor said, and the recommendation for the new specialist. Emily took notes while Sophie nodded along, looking more worn out than I'd ever seen her. After we went through all the details, we ended up talking about why they'd kept everything from me. Emily admitted they thought I wouldn't handle it well. She reminded me how I usually shut down during heavy conversations, and Sophie chimed in, saying they didn't want to burden me since I always seemed busy with work. It was tough to hear, but I understood where they were coming from. I thanked them for their honesty and apologized for not being more present. I I could see how my own actions had pushed them into thinking they needed to protect me. We decided to make a proper plan for Dad's care going forward. We set up a shared calendar with his appointments, splitting the responsibilities evenly. It felt like we were finally moving in the right direction, like a broken piece of our family was starting to heal. After the meeting, I talked to my girlfriend, who had been kept out of the loop until now. I told her everything, the secret chat, Dad's condition, and what we were dealing with. She listened quietly, then pulled me into a hug. She didn't try to offer solutions or tell me everything would be okay. She just asked how she could help. I didn't realize how much I needed that support until it was there. The next few days felt lighter somehow. We even managed to organize a family movie night. It was the first time in months that we'd all hung out just for fun, without the looming stress of doctor appointments or tough conversations. We put on an old comedy that Dad used to love. He laughed at all the right parts, even if he didn't seem to remember the movie. For a couple of hours, it felt like things were almost normal again. That night, I posted another update on Reddit. I shared how things had changed, how I'd been added to the family chat and was now part of the planning. I told everyone about the movie night, about the little moments that gave me hope. The responses were overwhelmingly positive. People commented about how strong we were as a family and how it was good to see us coming together. It was comforting to know there were people out there rooting for us, even if they were strangers. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. It wasn't the outcome I wanted, but it felt like we were all on the same side now. Maybe we couldn't fix everything, but at least we were in it together. And right now, that was enough. We scheduled a follow-up appointment with the specialist. This time, the doctor was more direct. He suggested we try a new medication that might help slow down the progression, but he warned us about potential side effects, including mood swings and aggression. The room went quiet. It was a tough call, and I could see my sisters already forming their own opinions. Later that evening, we had a family call to discuss the medication. Emily was all for it. She said we needed to try everything we could to help Dad, no matter the risks. Sophie, on the other hand, was hesitant. She'd read up on the medication and was worried about the side effects. She didn't want to make things worse for Dad, especially since he was already so fragile. The discussion quickly turned into an argument. Emily accused Sophie of being too emotional and not thinking logically. Sophie snapped back, saying Emily was trying to control everything like she always did. I could feel the old sibling dynamics coming back, the same fights we had as kids, just dressed up in adult problems now. I stepped in, suggesting we all take a day to cool off and do more research before making a decision. They grudgingly agreed. The next morning, I called a dementia specialist for a second opinion. We managed to get an appointment that same week. It felt like the right move, having a neutral party weigh in, someone who wasn't wrapped up in our family drama. The specialist was calm and thorough, explaining the potential benefits and risks in detail. He didn't sugarcoat it. The medication could help, but it was a gamble, and we'd need to monitor Dad closely for any changes. We left the appointment feeling more informed but still unsure. That evening, while we were trying to figure out our next steps, we got an unexpected visit from Aunt Lisa, my mom's sister. Lisa hadn't been involved in any of this so far. She lives out of state and hadn't even seen Dad since last Christmas. But now she was here, full of opinions, and none of them were helpful. Lisa started criticizing us right away. She made comments about how we'd handled things poorly, saying Dad should have been moved to an assisted living facility months ago. It was like she came in with a script, already convinced we were failing him. Emily and Sophie both went quiet, not knowing how to respond. I could feel the tension building. It was like we were back at square one, all the progress we'd made falling apart because of her unsolicited advice. I don't know what came over me, but I found myself standing up to her. I told Lisa that she had no right to judge us when she hadn't been around to help. She looked stunned, like no one had ever talked back to her before. I pointed out that we were the ones taking Dad to appointments, managing his care, and dealing with everything day to day. If she wanted to criticize, she should have been there from the start. I half expected Emily and Sophie to stay silent, but they backed me up. For the first time, we were a united front against an outsider trying to interfere. The confrontation seemed to bring us closer together. We realized that if we couldn't stick together, this whole situation would tear us apart. We decided, as a group, to try the new medication, but cautiously. We'd monitor Dad closely and stop it immediately if we saw any negative changes. For the first few days, everything seemed fine. Then the aggression started. It was subtle at first, Dad getting frustrated over small things, snapping at us when we asked simple questions. But it quickly escalated. One morning, he threw his coffee mug across the kitchen, something I'd never seen him do before. Sophie was in tears, trying to calm him down while Emily and I just stood there, shocked. The episodes became more frequent. Dad would have moments where he didn't recognize us, yelling at Sophie to leave his house or accusing Emily of stealing his things. It was terrifying. We'd expected some side effects, but nothing like this. We gathered at Emily's place again to figure out what to do. Sophie was a mess, saying she couldn't handle seeing Dad like this anymore. Even Emily, who's usually the strong one, admitted she was scared and didn't know what to do. It was a rare moment of vulnerability for both of them. I suggested we look into hiring a professional caregiver, at least part-time. It wasn't something any of us wanted, but it was becoming clear we couldn't do this on our own anymore. They both nodded, exhausted and defeated. That night, I turned back to Reddit. I hadn't posted an update in a while, but I needed to get this off my chest. I wrote about everything: the new medication, the aggression, the visit from Aunt Lisa, and how we were struggling to cope. I asked for advice from anyone who'd dealt with something similar. The response was overwhelming. People shared stories about their own parents, offering tips and support. Some suggested we stop the medication immediately, while others gave recommendations for professional help. It felt good to read through the comments, to know we weren't alone in this. We decided to take a break from the medication, at least until we could get a better handle on things. The aggressive episodes started to ease off, but we knew we had a long road ahead. It was one of those moments where we realized this was our new normal, and we'd have to keep adapting, no matter how hard it got. As I turned off my phone that night, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. We didn't have all the answers, but at least we were facing it together now, and for the first time in a while, that felt like enough. Update 5. The weeks after stopping Dad's medication were tough, but things finally started to level out. We knew we couldn't keep doing this on our own. We'd been putting off the conversation about hiring a professional caregiver, but it was time. Emily, Sophie, and I sat down for a serious discussion. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were exhausted. We couldn't be there 24/7, and Dad needed more help than we could give. It wasn't the decision any of us wanted, but we agreed it was what he needed. The next step was interviewing caregivers, which felt like a huge task. We went through a long list of candidates, talking to agency after agency. Some people seemed kind, but inexperienced. Others were professional, but came across as cold. We needed someone who could handle the medical side of things, but also connect with Dad on a personal level. After what felt like dozens of interviews, we finally met Karen. She was in her 50s, had years of experience with dementia patients, and most importantly, she had a warmth about her. She didn't rush through her answers, and she asked thoughtful questions about Dad, his interests, his routines, what made him smile. By the end of the meeting, we all felt like she was the right fit. We set up a family meeting to talk through the new plan, this time including Dad. It was a bittersweet moment. Dad was quieter than usual, but in a rare moment of clarity, he looked at all of us and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you kids." We hadn't heard him sound so coherent in weeks. Emily teared up, and Sophie squeezed his hand. It felt like a small gift, a moment of the old Dad shining through the fog. The day Karen started was harder than I expected. We'd spent the morning going over his routine with her, showing her where everything was. She listened patiently, taking notes and asking questions. When it was time for us to leave, I found myself lingering, not ready to go. I ended up spending most of the day there, just sitting with Dad. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. I just wanted to be there, soaking up the quiet moments. It felt like saying goodbye to the life we'd known, even if we weren't admitting it out loud. Over the next few weeks, we started to find a new rhythm. Having Karen there took a huge weight off our shoulders. It was an adjustment, but it gave us room to breathe. We could see Dad was more relaxed too, maybe because he wasn't sensing our stress anymore. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we could actually enjoy the time we spent with him, instead of always worrying about what might go wrong. With the immediate crisis behind us, the three of us started spending more time together outside of taking care of Dad. We'd grab coffee after visits, go for walks, and just talk. It was like we were rediscovering each other as siblings, not just as people stuck in a tough situation. One evening, we sat around Emily's kitchen table, reminiscing about our childhood. We laughed about old family vacations, the fights over the TV remote, and the time Sophie got lost at the zoo and we all panicked. For the first time in what felt like years, we weren't just coping, we were connecting. A few days later, I posted what I knew would be my final update on Reddit. I shared how things had changed, how hiring a caregiver was the toughest but best decision we'd made. I wrote about the family meeting, Dad's moment of clarity, and the bond that had started to form between us as siblings. I thanked everyone for their support. Reading through the comments over the past few months had made me feel less alone, like I had a whole community rooting for us. We kept moving forward, making plans for the future. I started thinking about ways to keep Dad's memory alive as his condition got worse. I made a photo album of our favorite moments together and started jotting down all the funny stories he used to tell. I didn't want those memories to fade away, even if he couldn't remember them anymore. Then, out of the blue, Aunt Lisa called. I almost didn't pick up, but I'm glad I did. She apologized for the way she'd acted before, admitting she'd been out of line. It was awkward at first, but I could tell she was sincere. I decided to let it go. There was no point in holding on to old grudges when we had bigger things to focus on. One afternoon, I was sitting with Dad and he looked up at me with a smile. He made a small joke about the weather, something he used to say all the time. It was a tiny moment, probably meaningless to anyone else, but it felt like a win. I held on to that moment, knowing they were becoming fewer and farther between. In my final Reddit post, I left a message I hoped would resonate with others going through something similar. Cherish the small moments. They're the ones that matter most. The comments were filled with people sharing their own stories of loss, hope, and love. It was like a collective hug from strangers, and it felt like the perfect way to end this chapter. As I sat there reading the responses, I realized I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. I knew there were still tough days ahead, but I didn't feel scared anymore. We'd made it through the worst of it together, and I knew we could handle whatever came next. For now, I'm focusing on the present, enjoying every moment I have left with Dad. There's no perfect ending here, but that's okay. We're taking it one day at a time, and that's enough.